What unfolds when one of the film industry's most revered performers sits down for what should have been a standard publicity appearance, only to discover that the host across from him appears intent on turning the segment into a confrontation? So the result was one of the most awkward and tension-filled moments to air on daytime television in years. Legendary actor Al Pacino found himself locked in a steadily intensifying exchange that ultimately ended with him walking off the set during a live broadcast. The appearance was meant to be straightforward, a guest spot on The View to discuss his newest project. Pacino, the iconic performer celebrated for roles in The Godfather, Scarface, and numerous other cinematic landmarks, has long been recognized for his fierce on-screen presence, as well as his professionalism off-camera. Now in his 80s, he has participated in countless interviews throughout a career spanning more than 5 decades. From in-depth conversations about craft to playful late-night exchanges, he has handled them all with composure and thoughtfulness. Yet from the instant he stepped onto the set that morning, something felt off. The customary greetings seemed strained, lacking the easy warmth typically exchanged before the cameras start rolling. There was a subtle but unmistakable tension in the air, the kind that seasoned performers instinctively notice. Pacino, with decades of experience reading rooms and audiences, appeared aware that this would not be an ordinary promotional stop. Co-host Joy Behar, known for her sharp wit and pointed political commentary, seemed ready to steer the discussion in a direction far removed from the usual light talk show format. From her opening question, it was evident she had a specific angle in mind. She leaned forward and began by referencing his new film, but quickly pivoted to his earlier work. She asked whether he ever regretted portraying violent characters, specifically referencing his role in Scarface. Did he ever worry, she pressed, about glorifying brutality? Didn't Hollywood, she suggested, bear some responsibility for the influence its films might have on audiences? Caught somewhat off guard by the abrupt tone, Pacino paused. His eyes narrowed slightly, a familiar expression to anyone who has watched his performances. He responded carefully, acknowledging that the question carried weight. He explained that storytelling often involves examining the full spectrum of human nature, including its darkest corners. Artists, he said, are interpreters of life rather than moral lecturers. Others. Behar persisted, suggesting that characters like Tony Montana had inspired imitation among young viewers. Didn't he feel accountable for that impact? Around the table, the other hosts shifted uneasily. This was not the direction most had anticipated so early in the segment. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to ease the atmosphere by pivoting to a question about his preparation process, perhaps hoping to redirect the focus to craft. However, Behar interrupted, insisting that the topic at hand was too important to sidestep. She emphasized that Pacino had earned significant wealth portraying violent figures and implied that this demanded explanation. The actor's expression hardened. He replied that his responsibility lay in delivering truthful, committed performances. If there was to be a philosophical discussion about art and accountability, he was open to it. But he sensed that the exchange was veering toward provocation rather than meaningful dialogue. He remarked that after more than 50 years in the industry, he understood the distinction between an interview and an interrogation. The studio atmosphere grew heavy. Crew members seemed unsure where to direct their cameras. The remaining hosts appeared visibly uncomfortable, yet Behar pressed forward. She dismissed the idea that she was interrogating him, asserting that she was simply posing legitimate inquiries about his professional choices. She contrasted her experience covering current events with his career of portraying fictional figures for financial gain. In her view, films centered on crime and aggression contributed to broader cultural problems. Around the table, other co-hosts attempted to regain control. Sonny Hostin tried steering the discussion toward his creative process, hoping to redirect attention to artistry rather than accusation. Immediately shut down the effort, saying the issue at hand was too significant to abandon. She framed it as a necessary conversation about powerful figures in entertainment facing scrutiny. Pacino's tone shifted, acquiring a sharper edge. He explained that he had endured criticism throughout his career and had grown from it. However, he distinguished thoughtful evaluation from what he perceived as hostility. He accused her of entering the segment with a predetermined narrative, uninterested in genuine exchange. She declared that her objective was to hold influential men accountable, speaking with the cadence of a speech rather than a dialogue. Pacino reacted to her reference to his world, rising slightly in his chair and gripping the armrests. Chetza. He told her she knew little about his experiences, the early struggles, the relentless dedication to craft, the respect he maintained for storytelling and for audiences. He felt she had constructed an image of him long before he had spoken. Behar countered that decades of his filmography provided ample evidence. In her assessment, his body of work reflected and reinforced troubling aspects of masculinity in American culture. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the quiet whir of equipment. Crew members paused, sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding live. Pacino shook his head slowly. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but simmering with restrained anger. Over a lifetime in the industry, he said, he had encountered all kinds of individuals, supportive colleagues, harsh critics, and those simply performing their duties. Rarely, however, had he faced someone so intent on diminishing another person, seemingly driven by personal motives. Behar's voice wavered briefly before she reasserted herself, insisting the matter was about responsibility rather than ego. She suggested that perhaps his generation struggled with the concept. That remark provoked another flash in his eyes. He reminded her that his generation had built much of the cinematic landscape that current commentators now analyze. They had taken creative risks, developed new storytelling methods, and established a foundation upon which others benefited. To be lectured about accountability after decades of work struck him as dismissive. She replied defiantly that difficult questions needed to be asked because too many entertainment reporters were dazzled by celebrity. Pacino responded with a short, humorless laugh. He argued that ambushing a guest with sweeping allegations about inciting violence did not qualify as rigorous inquiry. It resembled hostility masquerading as principle. Alyssa Farah Griffin made another attempt to interject, referencing his philanthropic efforts in hopes of shifting the focus. Behar snapped that the topic would not change. She reiterated that they were discussing the societal impact of violent media and demanded to know why he believed himself exempt from criticism. He answered that he was not seeking exemption, but fairness. He wanted an honest conversation rather than a prosecution. In his view, she had already decided what he symbolized, and nothing he offered would alter that perception. She continued, accusing him of embodying everything she believed was flawed within Hollywood: entrenched networks of influence, glamorized aggression, and outdated notions of masculinity cloaked in awards and acclaim. Pacino regarded her steadily, and those watching sensed a shift within him. The visible anger that had flared moments earlier seemed to settle into something more resolute, as if he were weighing his next move carefully, while the studio waited in breathless anticipation. A subtle change came over him, something resembling sympathy rather than fury. He regarded Joy Behar for a long moment before speaking again, his tone now unusually steady. He explained that he had arrived intending to discuss his latest work, to engage viewers, and perhaps even enjoy the exchange. Over decades in the public eye, he had participated in thousands of interviews and had consistently approached them with courtesy, regardless of how probing or difficult the questions might be. She interjected with a self-satisfied smile, suggesting that his reaction was simply what happened when a public figure was confronted and disliked the scrutiny. To her, this was proof of the very entitlement she had been describing. The expression on Al Pacino's face shifted again, but not toward anger. It was the look of someone who had reached a limit defined less by rage and more by deep discouragement. He repeated the word entitled quietly, as if weighing its meaning. Then he asked her to listen closely. He spoke about dedicating his entire life to the craft of acting, about immersing himself in characters, studying them, living within their psychology, and striving to bring authenticity to each performance. He emphasized that he had never demanded easy interviews or special handling. Quote, he had never shied away from challenging topics. What was happening now, however, felt less like journalism and more like personal targeting. She scoffed at the suggestion, framing her questions as legitimate examination of his filmography. In her view, invoking harassment was another example of Hollywood insulation from real accountability. She accused him of bristling simply because someone dared to pose a direct question. His voice lowered further, becoming quieter yet more intense. He explained that a substantive question might have explored his creative process, how he approached morally complex roles, how his perspective on responsibility had changed over time, or how decades in the industry had shaped him. Instead, he felt she had chosen to assign him blame for societal ills beyond his control. Around the table, the remaining co-hosts exchanged anxious looks. Whoopi Goldberg attempted once more to redirect the segment toward his new project, offering a gentle transition. Behar stopped her immediately, insisting the central issue remain. She pressed him to state clearly whether he believed his violent films had harmed society. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was a trace of weary sadness. He asked if she genuinely wanted his answer. She affirmed emphatically. He replied that he believed meaningful art serves as a mirror, reflecting the realities of society back to itself. Sometimes that reflection is uncomfortable, even disturbing. The characters he portrayed were not designed as aspirational heroes, he said, but as warnings. He referenced Tony Montana from Scarface, noting that the character's story ends not in triumph but in isolation and death. He alluded to Michael Corleone from The Godfather, describing a conclusion marked by emptiness rather than fulfillment. These were tragedies, not celebrations. She cut in, arguing that not everyone interpreted them that way. He acknowledged that some viewers might miss the cautionary elements, but he insisted that misinterpretation was not the responsibility of the storyteller. He asked rhetorically whether artists should avoid difficult subjects simply because some audiences could misunderstand them. Should films be reduced to harmless simplicity to avoid all controversy? She dismissed the comparison as exaggerated. He countered that, expecting him to shoulder blame for how others chose to interpret fiction was unreasonable. He invoked the example of blaming a playwright for crimes committed by someone who read a dramatic work, making the broader point about the limits of artistic accountability. Her frustration became more visible. She warned him against comparing himself to literary giants, accusing him of arrogance. He clarified that he was not elevating himself to that level, but illustrating a principle about art and interpretation. He told her she seemed uninterested in understanding that nuance, preferring instead to continue attacking. She responded that what she sought was transparency, something she believed the entertainment industry often lacked. At that, his composure began to crack. His voice rose as he declared that, in his long career, this ranked among the most unprofessional interviews he had experienced. He remarked that even photographers waiting outside restaurants had shown him greater courtesy than he was receiving at that moment on The View. She mocked the statement, implying that a famous actor unused to criticism was finally encountering the real world. The sarcasm was unmistakable. The atmosphere in the studio felt strained to its breaking point. Crew members stood still, uncertain how to respond as the confrontation unfolded live. Pacino did not respond immediately to the taunt. Instead, he looked across the table, his anger now replaced by something steadier and more resolved. The energy in his posture changed, as though he were no longer trying to persuade but deciding how much longer he would remain part of the exchange. That was the instant everyone present sensed the situation had crossed an irreversible line. Al Pacino rose slowly from his chair, and the simple motion seemed to drain the energy from the studio. The shift was palpable. Conversation stopped. Equipment hummed in the background, and all eyes locked onto him. He addressed Joy Behar in a tone that was no longer heated but measured and steady. He explained that he had spent more than half a century in the film industry, collaborating with extraordinary directors, actors, and writers across multiple generations. Over that time, he had received criticism from people deeply knowledgeable about their craft, and he had grown from those critiques. Yet never, he said, had he encountered what felt like such overt disrespect from someone presenting themselves as a professional interviewer. Behar began to interject with a familiar phrase about handling pressure, but Pacino raised his hand gently, stopping her. He stated that he had listened to her extensively, and that it was now his turn to speak without interruption. He reminded her that he had come onto the set of The View as a guest, carrying respect for the program and for the viewers at home. He had been prepared for a thoughtful exchange about his career, his experiences, and the project he was promoting. Instead, he felt he had been turned into a target for broader frustrations about the entertainment world. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Behar appeared momentarily taken aback by the calm authority in his voice. He continued, saying he did not know what had fueled such visible anger on her part, and he did not particularly care. What he did know was that he would not remain seated while being used as an outlet for grievances. He asserted that he had conducted himself with professionalism throughout the segment, whereas he believed she had approached him with hostility. He declared that he was finished with the exchange. Behar regained her composure and accused him of retreating, likening his decision to that of other celebrities unable to withstand scrutiny. At that, Pacino's mouth curved into a restrained smile, though there was no warmth behind it. He questioned whether what had transpired could genuinely be described as criticism. Throughout his career, he said he had welcomed thoughtful evaluation from intelligent, skilled individuals because it sharpened his work. What had unfolded here, however, did not resemble constructive critique. It felt mean-spirited, and he remarked that life was too brief to spend energy engaging with unnecessary hostility. As he reached to detach his microphone, visible unease rippled through the production team. Producers signaled frantically, and assistants hovered uncertainly. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward and pleaded with him not to leave, suggesting they could reset and begin again on a different note. Pacino glanced toward her with unmistakable respect and warmth. He acknowledged her professionalism and grace, but explained that he could not continue under the circumstances. Sensing the gravity of the moment, Behar made a final attempt to assert control. She told him to go ahead and walk away if he wished, implying that his departure would reveal his true character. But Pacino paused mid-motion, holding the microphone loosely. He turned to face her one last time. He answered that what defined him was not a single heated exchange, but decades of discipline and commitment. He described 50 years devoted to learning, rehearsing, and giving his full energy to every performance. He spoke of countless hours spent studying scripts, analyzing motivations, and striving to honor the art of storytelling. He emphasized that he carried genuine affection for audiences who supported the films he helped create. Most importantly, he said, he possessed enough self-respect to recognize when to step away from an environment that no longer felt constructive. With that, he handed the microphone to a stunned production assistant. The room remained frozen as he walked toward the edge of the set. Behar called out, reminding him that the broadcast was live and that he could not simply exit. He stopped briefly, turned back, and delivered a quiet response indicating that he absolutely could. Moments later, one of the most acclaimed figures in Hollywood history stepped off the stage of The View, leaving behind an audience unsure how to react. Co-hosts, visibly shaken, and a host whose expression had shifted from defiance to stunned realization. The cameras continued to roll, capturing the aftermath as the remaining panelists attempted to fill the sudden void with hurried commentary. No amount of improvised dialogue could fully erase what had just taken place. Viewers witnessed a confrontation that escalated beyond routine debate into a public breaking point. The scene lingered in the air, a vivid example of how quickly a tense exchange can unravel and how firmly some individuals choose to stand their ground when they believe respect has been compromised.